So we'll go ahead and get started. So again, my name is John Potter, and we'll be talking about using academic progress monitoring for individualized instructional planning. And kind of a heavy topic, a lot of technical information, but hopefully I've got some useful stuff for you and many resources that you can use as well as you move forward, like with your progress monitoring. So again, just like the opening session, if you're at that, we did this activity. Questions a little bit different, but I would just like you to share in the chat your name, your location, and your role, and then what's your familiarity or comfort with academic progress monitoring. So 0 meaning we don't do it, I don't know what it is, versus 4 is like we do it all the time. I could give this session because I know just a ton about academic progress monitoring, or somewhere in between. So 4, 3. People feeling pretty good about it. All right, 4. So lots of 3s and 4s. All right, maybe I'll just have several of you give the presentation, then make my job a little easier. All right, 3s, 4s. Yeah, good. 1, 2, kind of a range. Good. All right. A range of people from all over too. Rhode Island, Maryland, Philly, so some Chicago. Yeah, many teachers are 0 to 1. Yes, I agree. Progress monitoring is a challenging one for many teachers. So hopefully, even if you feel like you're pretty good around progress monitoring, hopefully there'll be something in here that you can take and use to support your teachers in progress monitoring. Okay, great. We'll go ahead and get started with the content then. Again, we'll try to save some time for questions in the end as well. So today, what we're really trying to accomplish within the next hour, 55 minutes, just an overview of progress monitoring, what it is, and then some approaches and tools where you can find some resources to help guide your thinking around academic progress monitoring. Again, we'll focus on academic progress monitoring. There's another session for behavior progress monitoring. So if you're interested in that, you can go to that one after this session. We'll talk a little bit about goal setting. So I know that's a big topic. Goal setting, where we set the goal, is hugely important with our kids, and it's not necessarily, there's not like one right answer to that, but I think we've got some good guidance in terms of how we can do that in an informed way. And then how do we make instructional decisions for individual students? So how do we look at data and make some decisions around what our next steps are? And then throughout it, we'll share some available NCII resources to help guide you, things you can go back to and access as you have time to and as you need. All right, so we'll start off just a general overview of progress monitoring and what it is. So, and many of you know this, but it's really repeated measurement student performance over time. So as we're delivering an intervention, it should be linked to an intervention. It's used to, basically tell if students are responsive to the intervention and determine, if we need to make changes to that. And so the key thing here is progress monitoring is really something that's linked to interventions. We should use it on a frequent basis to see if our interventions are working. Oftentimes I see some schools who want to progress monitor all their kids in the class, even kids that are not receiving interventions, on like a bi-weekly or monthly basis, just to kind of check in and see where they're at. I would wonder if that's a good use of resources, because progress monitoring takes time away from instruction. And if we're not providing intervention, we're not going to respond to that data. I would recommend against doing that for all your kids, and really reserving progress monitoring for kids that are receiving interventions to make sure that they're making progress. Now, that's not to say we still want to screen all kids 3 times a year. That should be done for all students 3 times a year, but monthly, weekly progress monitoring should really only occur for students that are receiving interventions. All right. So progress monitoring. So I wanted to kind of distinguish between monitoring progress and progress monitoring, because these terms get thrown around a little bit loosely, and just kind of orient to what we're kind of talking about today. And so on one hand, we talk about monitoring progress. This happens all the time in classrooms. This is just a natural thing that many teachers do. Sometimes they don't even know that they're doing it. But it's really those informal, unstandardized kind of check-ins with kids on a daily, hourly, minutely basis to really find, is our instruction impacting? It's those formative assessments that occur regularly just in the flow of instruction. So it's things like, just the way that we ask questions to kids. It's exit tickets. It's quick turn and talks with partners just to check where kids are at. These are things that should happen all the time to really be used with all students to make sure that kids are receiving our instruction, because instruction only matters if kids are actually learning from that instruction. So we need to have that interplay of, it's not just me teaching, what are the kids getting? And I change my instruction dynamically to match what the students need. So that's monitoring progress. What we're going to talk about today more is progress monitoring, which is really the use of a valid and reliable measure that has some sort of standardized administration to measure responsiveness to an intervention. So the frequency is going to depend on the intensity of the instruction and the recommendations of the test developer. So, for example, for kids that have more intensive needs, so kids at that more tier 3 individualized level, we're probably going to be monitoring kids weekly because we want to make sure that we're not losing any time. For kids in tier 2 interventions, that may be a monthly check-in through progress monitoring, maybe bi-monthly, so twice a month. We're looking at that. But part of that, again, is also driven by the test developers have recommendations for about how frequently those should be given. Progress monitoring requires that you graph the data and use the data to interpret, how students are doing, and you need a fair amount of data to do that. So 6 to 9 data points is about a minimum in terms of what we want to look at to be able to look at a trend. Because as we know, kids have good and bad weeks. Like they may have a bad week progress monitoring, a good week progress monitoring. We don't want to over, compensate due to one data point, because it could be a bad data point or it could be a good data point. But really, progress monitoring is about looking at a trend of data over multiple weeks to make sure kids are either headed in the right direction, hopefully, or if they're not headed in the good direction, that we can modify and intensify our intervention supports to make sure that they head in a better direction. Progress monitoring also going to be used for entitlement decisions for students receiving targeted intensive intervention. So that idea of, we want to know our kids responsive to the interventions. In many states, that's one way that we identify kids for disabilities, is looking at that response to particular interventions that we are providing for them. So it can also be used for that. But overall, progress monitoring is more standardized administration, reliable, valid measures. Monitoring progress is more informal, unstandardized check-ins with kids. So why is progress monitoring important? Because that data is highly useful in order for a number of reasons. And so first, it allows us to estimate the rate of improvement across time. Again, it's not just looking at one data point, but it's looking at an average over time of where students are headed. If we're delivering an intervention, I don't want to wait until 6 to 8 weeks, the intervention may be almost over, to find out, did it work or did it not work? I want to monitor progress all along the way to be able to change instruction in a responsive way to what the students need. So it'll allow us to do that with our students. It's also going to allow us to compare how effective our different forms of instruction are. So as we deliver an intervention or instructional package, and then we change it, we can see that change, the effect of that change in the data. We can see the data go up, we can see the data go down, but we can start to understand a little bit better the impact of our instruction and start to see what works for students and what doesn't work for students. Because we don't want to spend time on what doesn't work. We want to spend our time on what's going to work for most of our students. It's going to identify our students who are not making adequate progress. So we'll talk about goal setting and growth and what that looks like. And so it's going to help us say, this is not on track. We need to make a change for our students. And it's going to determine when that is. So again, we'll talk about decision rules and how we can use that data to guide kind of what we're thinking in terms of when to change. It's also an important tool to support communication with parents and students. I would advocate, openly sharing progress monitoring data with parents and students because it's helpful for them to stay informed on the growth or lack of growth that their students are making. We often see, especially students with disabilities, parents sometimes don't understand where their kids are at, or if they're making growth, or if they're not making growth. We want to be open about sharing this so they can be partners in this and help problem solve when kids are not making growth, but also celebrate the successes, right? Like, we want to show kids when they're successful. We want to show parents when their kids are doing well. So we want to openly share that data as much as we can. And then it's going to support the development of, present levels of performance, IEP goals, monitoring plan. Progress monitoring is highly useful and valid for IEPs. And if you're familiar with kind of the research and the origins of progress monitoring in general, it really came a lot out of special ed literature and special ed research. So it was primarily designed as a way to monitor progress for students with disabilities. So we want to be able to use a lot of those tools to be able to support our kids with disabilities. So progress monitoring and DBI, if you attended the opening session, or if you're familiar with DBI, it occurs in a couple of different places. So, obviously at the top there, after we deliver that validated tier 2 standard intervention, we're going to monitor progress to see if we need to intensify. And then even if we do need to intensify, we're going to deliver an intervention adaptation, and we're still going to monitor progress. And so again, progress monitoring should be tied to interventions. Whenever you're delivering an intervention, there should be a progress monitoring plan as part of that, both for students with disabilities and for students who don't have identified disabilities. If students are receiving an intervention anywhere, they should be receiving progress monitoring. And so to get started with progress monitoring, the first thing that we need to do really is to select the target and the measure. So what are we trying to measure? What are the skills that we want kids to learn? And how are we going to get a measure to really monitor that and measure that in a way that's going to be meaningful for us? And so the first step is really determine the target behavior. So what is it? Is it reading? Is it math? Is it writing? But breaking it down even further within those areas. So for example, with reading, are we looking at phonemic awareness? Are we looking at phonics? Are we looking at fluency? There's a range of different measures that measure different reading sub-skills that we want to really tap into the most appropriate ones to see growth. And so you can identify a measure. There's a couple different types of measures that we can use for progress monitoring. The first on the left, you see there is a single skill measure. Sometimes you might hear these referred to as mastery measurement, but it's more of, we're looking at discrete skills that we're teaching to students and monitoring until they develop and are proficient at that skill. And then we move on and monitor the next one. And so for this one, it's maybe we're looking at specific letter sounds. And so we monitor the short vowel sound because we're focused on that for a few weeks. They develop that A sound, then we switch and we work on the short vowel I sound. They get proficient on that, so we switch to the next one. That's one way of looking at it. The other way that I would look at it that's going to be, I think, more helpful over the long term is what's known as general outcome measures. So sometimes you'll hear these referred to as also as like curriculum-based measurement. CBMs are also general outcome measures. But whereas a single skill measure is going to measure one skill at a time, general outcome measures are going to measure all of the skills within an area that kids need to learn. And so, for example, a general outcome measure, rather than measuring A, then I, then O, they would have all those sounds on a probe, and then kids would see growth as they develop each sound. So as they develop the A, the O sound, the I, the E, all those sounds, you would see that trajectory go up. For general outcome measures, the level of difficulty is held constant. So when you see growth, that means kids are gaining skills, not necessarily that the test is changing or measuring something easier. So when you see progress monitoring measured, mostly you're going to see that as general outcome measures or CBMs. So in terms of where you can go to start to identify some of these key characteristics and evaluate, progress monitoring measures, NCII has a tools chart, a progress monitoring tools chart that can be useful for that. So a few things to think about that you want to have in your progress monitoring, academic progress monitoring measure. You want to have a sufficient number of alternate forms that are equal in controlled difficulty. Again, they should be measuring the same level of difficulty. They shouldn't get easier or harder, because then it's hard to say if students are growing. Now, that's not to say they're going to be exactly the same level of difficulty, right? So we think about things like an oral reading fluency probe is a great progress monitoring measure. But there's certain things that we just simply can't control for when we develop those measures. we can't control for a student's background knowledge. Like you've got kids that will come in that if they're reading a topic they know a lot about, like, they're probably going to score better on it, versus if they're reading about a topic that they don't like or don't have background knowledge on, they're probably going to score lower. But overall, that bounce shouldn't be a lot. They should be about the same level of grade level difficulty. And so we want to have an equal number of, sufficient number of alternate forms, and usually that's 20 or more forms, because we want to be able to monitor students across the year. So if we're monitoring each week or every other week, we have enough forms to get through a year to be able to monitor their progress across the course of the year. We also want to have some level of specification of what is acceptable minimum growth. So, and again, the tools chart has some guidance on this for each of the tools, but you should know like how much growth is enough. It's not just enough to see growth with kids. We want to know how much is enough. So there should be some specification about how much kids should be growing. They should also provide benchmarks for minimum acceptable end of the year performance. So basically that's where do we expect kids to be at the end of the year to say that they're at grade level or they are proficient in a skill. Your progress monitoring measure should have that. That should be in the form of benchmarks or percentile ranks or some way of saying if kids get to this score, they're generally going to be on track. Now, many of the benchmarks that you'll see in academic progress monitoring are built off the idea of if kids get to that benchmark, then they are 80 to 90% likely to meet future benchmarks. Versus if kids are in the lowest range, sometimes the intensive, the well below benchmark range, if kids are in that range at the end of the year, they're oftentimes less than 10 to 5% likely to meet future benchmarks, unless we intervene at a high rate. So basically those benchmarks set a way for us to feel more comfortable that kids are on track when they meet those benchmarks. And so your progress monitoring measure should have that built into it. And then they should be reliable and valid measures. So they should have some level of information that shows that they're reliable and valid. Both the benchmark is predictive of future performance, and that when students grow on it, that means something, right? Then students are getting better at a skill. That means that they're on track for success. We don't want to measure where students are growing, but they're actually not on track for success because the measurement isn't meaningful. And so most of your progress monitoring measures should have some level of reliability and validity for those scores, and most do. So if you look at the tools chart, you'll see that most have set those. All right, so just real quick kind of pause here. So in the chat, if you could just put in what academic areas do you currently feel pretty good about progress monitoring? You have measures that you usually feel good about, and are there academic areas that you need progress monitoring measures? Maybe you have a gap in what you're using, but you need something. So what do you feel good about for progress monitoring academic wise, and what maybe you need some more measures for? So I'll pause there. Feel good about reading, needs for math. I think that's a pretty common finding. Feel good about ORF, yeah. Math needs, feel good about reading. Phonics good, comprehension more difficult, yes. Need more for math. Yeah. Reading good, math needs, writing progress monitoring is needed, yeah. Yeah, so need some writing. Yeah, so I'm seeing some needs in math and writing to some extent. And I think those are, there's a lot of research around those, but those are a little bit, don't have as robust a research base, I think, as the reading ones. The reading ones are very well established. Reading measures around phonics, phonemic awareness, oral reading fluency. There's tons of really good measures for those. Math and writing a little less so, but there are some good math ones and some initial writing ones as well. So again, I would go to the NCII tools chart and kind of take a look at what's available. They do have some math measures in there as well that you can take a look at. All right. So we'll kind of move on to goal setting. So this is kind of a big topic. How do we set the goal? And this is important because how you set the goal really dictates how you respond to our kids making adequate progress or not. Because if we set a high goal and kids don't reach it, we might say that they're not making adequate progress. If we set a lower goal and a kid makes the exact same progress, but they're look like they're on track to meet that lower goal, we may say that yes, they're on track and we're not going to change anything. And so it's important where we set that goal. And so there's a few different ways to do that, not necessarily one right or wrong answer, but a few ways to kind of think about it. So we're going to talk about a few steps for goal setting, starting with we're going to establish the baseline. So where kids starting, we're going to choose a strategy for how we're going to set a goal. So where do we want kids to end up? How do we do that? And then how do we write a measurable goal specifically, for an IEP? How do we want to have our goal set up? All right. So in terms of establishing a baseline, there's a few different ways you can do this. I'd say the easiest way is option 1 on the left there, which is basically you want to use the screening score for the baseline. And so you're screening all kids, even students with disabilities should receive, academic screening 3 times a year. And so we can use that as the same tool that we use for progress monitoring. So for example, if you're using something like FastBridge or Dibbles or Acadience or any of those measures, we can use that as our baseline score because that screening score is a pretty robust, reliable, valid score. If you don't have that, so say you're in the middle of between screening periods or you don't have a solid screener, you can actually administer 3 progress monitoring probes in one sitting and then look at the median score. So by median, we need the middle score, not the high score, not the low score, but the middle score. So if we're looking at these 3 probes here, we would say the middle score, their baseline would be 79 words correct with 3 errors. That would be where they're starting at. That's their baseline. And the reason we do that is because it's going to basically control for students can have a bad story or a bad passage, a bad reading. They can have a really good one. We're going to throw those 2 out. We're going to say which one's in the middle. And that's the one that we're going to use. And typically with a lot of screeners, that's actually how like an orally fluency probe is administered for a screener. They actually typically get, a lot of them get 3 passages and then we take the median score. So it's using that same way to do it with the baseline. And so once we have a baseline, then it comes down to really choosing a strategy for goal setting that's going to really fit and be most appropriate for students. And so I'm going to walk through these 3 different ways to do it. There's also this handout that is provided that's linked in the resources, but really you can go back and look at the handout, but we're going to talk through each of these and how we can kind of set those goals. So the first option, and I would say probably the easiest option, is going to be to set the goal at the benchmark. So, and that's basically saying that the level of performance is expected on the specific measure at a specific point in time is the end of the student's grade level benchmark. And so we want the student to be at grade level by the end of the year. So we're just going to say we want the student to be at this level. So basically all you need to do for that is you determine what is the end of level grade benchmark, and then you graph it by drawing a line between where the student is starting and where the benchmark is at the end of the year. And so it's going to look a little something like this. So if you've got a student that say, this is a 2nd grade probe, connected text, orally fluency, maybe they're reading 15 words per minute at the beginning of the year. We say the end of the year benchmark, spring benchmark is 90 words correct. We're just going to draw a line from point A to point B. And this is our goal. And we're going to monitor the progress of this student against that goal. It's easy, straightforward. It is an ambitious goal, and it is an appropriate goal because it is the end of the year benchmark. It's where we want kids to be proficient. So it's very cut and dry and easy to do. So easy to use, tracks towards grade level expectations, and it is also efficient. It's very easy to do for multiple students at the same time. So it doesn't take a lot of time to do that. However, there are some considerations or things that we want to think about if we're using the benchmark. So for some students, that may not be a realistic, appropriate end of the year goal. And so I'm thinking about kids where, you look at the growth rate that it would take for them to get to that end of the year goal. Maybe that growth rate is so high that it's not really something that, to be honest, any kid or many kids have ever really done successfully. Like if we're expecting a kid to grow, 4 or 5 words correct a week, that's going to be a real steep ask and may not be realistic. And you may be setting expectations too high, causing the teacher to get frustrated and the student to get frustrated because they can't meet that goal. And so we want to think about that piece. And so for some students, setting grade level benchmarks that are off grade level or more individualized may be more appropriate. My general rule of thumb is for students in tier 2 interventions, that just need a little bit of an extra boost. I typically set the goal at the benchmark because that's meaningful, that's realistic for those students. For students that are individualized at tier 3 through the DBI process, maybe it's the benchmark, but maybe it's really looking at growth rates and determining what might be a little bit more appropriate for students. Okay. All right. So in terms of finding benchmarks, there's published research around them. This link will take you to, compiled norms around oral reading fluency. These are national, so across a broad range of passages, very large sample of students that you can look at. And they actually may have updated ones in 2020 as well. I'm not sure. But if you look at, if you just Google like Hasbrook and Tyndall ORF norms, you'll find probably whatever is most recent out there. But they're large, they're broad. They give you an idea of, where students should be scoring depending on their percentile for each grade level. But honestly, most data systems have a benchmark built into them. They'll either have like a specific benchmark or they'll give you a percentile rank that you should be shooting for. So if it doesn't, you can use some general norms, but most of them should have benchmarks built into them. All right, so that's benchmarks. That's the easy, kind of straightforward first way to do it. The next way to do it is looking at national norms for rate of improvement, or ROI. And so this is basically saying we want our students to grow at the same or typical rate as other students. So basically, what growth is realistic? We can say other kids have grown around this rate, so we can expect kids to grow at around this rate to reach a goal. And so there's a formula for calculating this. So a little bit of math involved in this. But the idea is you're going to take that rate of improvement, you're going to multiply it by the number of weeks that you're setting the goal for. You're going to add where they're starting at, their baseline score, and that's going to give you the goal. So for example, if we find that at second or third grade, students on average grow 2 digits per week on a math probe, we know that's the average. Our intervention is going to run for 10 weeks. We multiply 2 digits a week times 10 weeks. So 20 digits is what we want them to grow across the 10 weeks. We add that to their starting baseline, which in this case is 30. We say we want the student to end at 50 digits correct. So if they grow at that typical rate, that's completely doable, it's realistic, that's where they should end up. So what that looks like is we start at 30, we say in 10 weeks, we want them to be at 50, we draw a line, and then we're just gonna monitor progress and evaluate their growth against this specific aim line here. So pros and cons. So pros, it provides a mechanism for writing ambitious but realistic goals because we're using growth rates that we've seen before. We're not going to set the goal too high, we know, because we know that this is possible. So it's often useful when the benchmark is unrealistic. We can look at growth rates to set the goal instead of saying at the benchmark because it might be a little bit more realistic for students. However, there are things to consider if doing it this way. So one thing that may have already come to mind is that if we're using average growth rates to set a growth goal for kids that are already starting behind, if they're growing at the same rate or the typical growth rate as other kids are, they're going to end up the same amount of distance behind their peers as they started. And so in thinking about this, some progress monitoring tools will actually have ambitious goals built into them. So not average goals, but they have goals built in to say some kids who receive intensive intervention will make this level of growth. So that may be 1.5 times average growth, that may be 2 times average growth. But if I would recommend, if you're using, especially for kids with IEPs, kids with disabilities, if you're using this method to set a goal, you need to set the goal over the average growth rate. Because if you're setting a goal at the average growth rate, you're basically just saying that the kid's going to continue to be behind. And so you want to accelerate that, be ambitious. Maybe it's 1.5 times, maybe it's 2 times, but you want to set an ambitious growth rate. Yeah, so that's kind of how kind of the pros and cons of that method. So I would use it for more individualized tier 3 students to set a more individualized goal and see what's possible. So within NCII, their tools chart, they actually do have a lot of the measures do have growth rates built into them. So you can actually access that and see what is a typical growth rate for a student using a particular measure. Because while they're all these measures are grade level measures, like a FastBridge or Reading Fluency probe is second grade probe is measuring second grade content, and then a Acadian second grade probe is also measuring second grade content. The level of difficulty and growth may be a little bit different. They're not necessarily transferable. So you want to look at the specific measure. So the third option is this intra-individual framework. And I think this is the more complex option. But in this way, we're going to use the student's previous growth rate to calculate an individualized goal. I would say this method is going to be more useful for kids who are starting the furthest behind. For kids with the greatest level of need, you may want to look at this level of growth. And so we've got a formula for doing this. So we're taking the slope. And so the slope is basically their current or previous rate of improvement. So you need to have some data already collected. So if we've had a student, we've collected data for 6 to 9 weeks, we can see what did they already grow. Maybe they grew 1 digit a week, half digit a week on their math probe. We can see where they're already growing. And then we're going to multiply that by a target growth rate. So that represents the growth needed to close the gap, or growth that is accelerating them beyond what they're currently seeing. So that may be they need to make 50% more growth than students. Maybe it's 100% more growth. But so if they're growing 1 digit a week, maybe we're setting that goal for, we're going to say 1.5 digits a week or 2 digits a week. And so that's going to be a number that's going to accelerate them beyond what they're currently growing at. So instead of measuring them against like peers or a benchmark, you're really measuring them against themselves. You're trying to grow at a faster rate than they currently are, because what we're seeing isn't going to get them caught up. And so we're multiplying the slope, that rate of improvement, times that target growth rate, and then just multiply by the number of weeks and add that baseline score. And so what that looks like is, maybe this is our student. They started at about 10 and at about 2019. We know that, that's not, that growth is not going to get them caught up. And so we say they grew at 1 word a week. We want to see them grow at 1.5 times a week. And so we say 1 word a week times 1.5 times the number of weeks, add in the baseline at 19. And this growth will get them 1.5 times growth of what they're currently seeing. Now, as you're looking at this isn't going to get them caught up to grade level, right? But it will accelerate them across the year and get them closer to grade level. So the way I like to think about it is, when you set the goal at the benchmark, you're basically saying, I want the student at grade level by the end of the year. And so our goal for every single student is really, we want them at grade level, right? We want them proficient and successful. But for some students, we need to recognize that may take a little bit longer. That may not be something, that may not be a year goal. That may be a 2-year goal, a 3-year goal. And so when setting goals, I think it's okay for some of our students to set a goal for this year below the grade level benchmark. But if you're doing so, I want you to think about in your teams, how does this goal get them caught up? And what is your long-term plan? Do you expect them to get the grade level in 2 years, in 3 years? Be thinking about how this kind of cuts that deficit to make sure that they're on track at some point to be at grade level. So we don't want to set low goals that are just going to keep kids, the same amount of behind their entire academic careers. We want to accelerate kids, right? So this goal, it's a valid strategy for setting goals for kids that are far below grade level. But considerations, it's difficult to understand, to be honest. It provides a little bit more training and support in calculating it. It's a complex formula. It requires having some baseline data in 6 to 9 weeks to be able to know what the student's growing at. And to be honest, it's not necessary for students performing at or near grade level. Again, kids at tier 2 that are just a little bit behind, like, they don't need that level of detail. Just set the goal at the benchmark and move on. So, but another way to set goals, especially for your kids that are significantly behind or have the most significant needs, right? And then the last step is we're just going to write a measurable goal. So we want our IEP goal to address the condition, the context, target behavior, all those pieces. So we've included just a sample template for IEP goals. Many of you are probably writing quality IEP goals. So you can take this, you can leave it. But the idea is, writing a goal when given this grade level, in this tool. So when given second grade oral reading fluency probes, the student will do what? The student will read fluently and correctly with what level of proficiency and time frame. So we'll read fluently and correctly at 90 words correct per minute with less than 2 errors by June 30th or whatever it is. But we want to have a very clear, consistent way of setting goals, so we can say it's measurable, it's observable, it's ambitious, but it's also realistic, right? So I'll pause there real quick, and in the chat, if you want to just kind of reflect on those 3 ways of setting goals and kind of maybe put in the chat, is there a current option that you currently use to set student goals? Are you using option 1, option 2, or option 3, or multiple options to set goals for your students with disabilities? So I'll give you a chance to do that. 1, 2, or 3, or 1, 2, and 3. Some 1s there, 1 and 3. Yeah. Again, 1's the easiest, so I think that's most consistent. 1 and 3. 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, and I'll add, I think progress monitoring measures have gotten more sophisticated, that many of them have goal setting utilities built into them or guidance on it. So I typically defer to the publishers, because many of them have good ways to set goals that are realistic using their tool. So, but yeah, setting goals at the end of the year benchmark is definitely a good way to start. So, great. All right, we will move on. All right, so setting the goal is the first step, right? You've got that goal, you've got that aim line set, but the next important thing is we have to evaluate student progress against that aim line, determine, what are our next steps based on what we're seeing from our students. And so there's a number of things that you could see in terms of how students respond to instruction and how we look at it against an aim line. And so basically, when you're collecting that progress monitoring, you're going to meet, semi-regularly, generally 6 to 8 weeks, 8 to 12 weeks, but somewhere in that time frame. You have access to that document, the former slide. Yes, it is linked on at the beginning. So yes, you can have access to that document. It's also on the NCII website. Is the student's performance improving is kind of the first question you're asking. And then, is the student's performance improving sufficiently to meet the goal? Now, these are distinct questions. And what I often see with teacher teams when looking at the data is they're more likely to answer the first one and sometimes less likely to answer the second one. Meaning, I will see a lot of teams that look at progress monitoring data and say, well, the graph's going up. They're on track, we're good, they're gaining skills, we're not going to make a change. And that's important that the graph is going up, they're gaining skills, but many times, they may not be gaining skills at a rate that is going to get them caught up to their peers. And when we think about gaining academic skills specifically, kids don't typically, it happens sometimes, but kids don't typically lose skills, right? If you learn something, you don't unlearn it. If we learn what the long O sound is, it's not like we're going to forget it. Sometimes, kids will seem like they forgot it, but that's because they probably never learned it in the first place. But kids' graphs in academics typically don't go down, or shouldn't. But it's a matter of, are they going up or flatlining? But are they going up at a rate that's going to be sufficient to meet the goal? And so we want to be able to answer that second question and understand, are we sufficiently getting to where we need to be? And so I'm going to run through various scenarios that you might see and how you want to respond to that. So, all right. And thank you, Mia, for putting the link in there for all the tools. So first situation. So, and you may see this a lot, especially for students with the most intensive needs, is where we see this flat line at the bottom of the graph, no progress, very little. The scores are super low, and we're just not seeing any movement at all. And so when we see this, typically, some of the questions I would ask are, there might be an issue with your progress monitoring measure or process. And so I would ask, is what you're progress monitoring aligned with what you're teaching? So for example, if we've got a 5th grade student who we're monitoring with a 5th grade oral reading fluency probe, but this student is so significantly far behind that we're looking at basic phonemic awareness skills, I wouldn't expect, them learning basic phonemic awareness is going to immediately show up on a 5th grade oral reading fluency progress monitoring probe. So we may look at monitoring at a lower level, or we may just look at a better fit between what we're teaching and what we're progress monitoring. But this is going to indicate generally an issue with your progress monitoring probe if they're not showing any progress at all. We may also see something like this. And I'm sure you've seen this, where the scores are just highly variable. One day it's super up, one day it's super down, but just a lot of bounce. Now, I will say in progress monitoring generally, even though it's the same level of difficulty, like kids are squirrely. Like there's a lot of things going on. Like kids will have a good week, they'll have a bad week. Like, and to some extent, you're going to see bounce in your progress monitoring measures. It's never, progress isn't a straight line. Like some weeks are going to be good, some weeks they're going to be bad. But we don't want to see bounce like this because this is concerning in terms of how the test is being administered. So this is where I would ask, are we administering it consistently across the day? Like, is it different people administering it where the high points are a different teacher than the low points? Is there something around motivation and engagement with the student where there's some significant life circumstances that are going on for some of those high and low points? Is the assessment consistently administered? Like, sometimes we're getting enough time to do it, sometimes we're rushing through it. But bounce this much indicates that we've got some issues going on with our administration, and we kind of want to go back and look at that. All right, so what happens if we've got a flat trend line or going down a little bit? So not necessarily at the bottom of the graph, but just going down a little bit or not making any growth. This I would first ask, assuming, again, maybe an assumption, but if we assume that we put together a good plan, so our specially designed instruction has matched their need, we've gone through that DBI process, we've got the right instruction, the right curriculum, the right environmental supports in place, and we're not seeing any growth at all, the first question I would ask is fidelity. Are we actually administering that intervention with fidelity? Are we doing the components of it? And if we're not, like, that's the first thing I would change, because we assume that if we got some match, we should see some level of growth. It may not be enough growth to catch up, but we should see an upward trend. If we're not seeing an upward trend, it might be about fidelity. It may also be the wrong progress monitoring measure. It might not be matched to the student need, but I would first ask if they're not going up. I would look at fidelity. If we look at fidelity and find that they are being implemented with fidelity, this is not the right intervention for this student. Like, we've done this, we've tried it, we've done it accurately and with fidelity. We don't need more of this. This is not going to get us to where we want to go. So we would want to make a change. So what happens though if we actually have some growth? The trend line is increasing, but it's not as steep as the goal line. So they're going up, but it's not on track to get them to the goal. So for this one, I would ask a couple questions. So first, I want to know, was the appropriate method used to set the goal? So maybe this is a case where the benchmark was too high, and the growth rates indicate that kids aren't typically able to make that type of growth. So if a kid is making ambitious growth, maybe this is ambitious growth from where they're starting, then I would say, maybe we need to set a more appropriate goal. Maybe we need to look at a better goal setting method, set that based on growth rates and not based on a benchmark. But I also look at, maybe we need to intensify the intervention. And so going back to the previous slide, this slide, like, I don't want more of this. Like, this is not working. We need to change and do something different. This, on the other hand, I think I want more of this. Like, it's working, it's just not working fast enough. And so how do we intensify? How do we build in more opportunities to respond? How do we build in more supports? How do we build in more feedback? All those things can help hopefully accelerate, because this is working, it's just not working fast enough. And so rather than changing to something new, like, I'm not going to get a new program or do something drastically new. This is working, it's just not working fast enough. So how do we intensify, provide more time, smaller group size, something like that to get a student more on track? What if the trend line is steeper than the goal line? So they're going up at a higher rate than the goal line. Like, this one, this is not a problem. This is what we want to see, right? We want to see kids increasing at a rate higher than the goal, assuming that the goal was appropriately ambitious. If we've got a low goal and they're exceeding it, we still want to maybe look at setting a higher goal that's appropriate. But say the goal set at the end of the year benchmark for this kid, this student is on track to meet the end of the benchmark. I would continue doing what you're doing. And it's possible maybe this kid meets the end of the year goal before the end of the year. We might be able to exit this kid. But in general, like this is what we want to see. We want to see growth higher than the aim line, than the goal line. So what if we find a flat or a trend line that's going up but not high enough, and we make a change? Then after that change, we find less growth. Like we find that we're flatlining now, or we're going down a little bit. We want to go back as a problem-solving team and kind of think about why might the original intervention have worked better? So that's that problem-solving process, that DBI process of looking at, well, maybe we need to go back and do more of what is in the first group of data than the second group of data. So we need to put our brains together and kind of think through, what can we do to accelerate growth rather than change something? And then this is something you hope to see. This is another positive one. So we make an instructional change. This is a student who is making growth, but not enough to catch up to their goal. We make a change and we accelerated that. So now they're on track to meet their goal. So this is a student, again, I'll continue the intervention, monitor the student's progress through the end of the year. They're on track. If they stay on track, we continue to deliver these services. I would bet that they would reach the end of the year goal. And maybe next year we can exit them from intervention. So this type of data is something that we want to celebrate and continue and replicate for other kids if we can. All right. So that's how we kind of evaluate data against like an aim line using a goal and a baseline. But we also want to have some decision rules for how we evaluate that data. And there's a few ways to have decision rules. But we talked about at the beginning, Amy talked about just the issues around DBI and how it can support equity. And so we want to think about setting some decision rules, because that can increase equity of our decision making and not make it a different decision that's made from classroom to classroom, from school to school. And so it shouldn't be incumbent on individual teacher teams to always figure out what's adequate progress and what's not. We should have some consistency in that, because research has shown in the absence of data, we have implicit biases. We have all sorts of other biases that cloud our judgment and make it difficult to really clearly think through, is a student making progress or is a student not making enough progress? So we want to think through that and have some decision rules. And so I want to talk about just real briefly a couple different options. These aren't the only options, but these are two of the more highly used options for measuring your data against an aim line. So I'll talk about the 4-point rule, and I'll talk about using a trend line. All right, so the 4-point rule. So I would wait until you have at least 3 weeks of data in instruction and at least 6 data points. And so 3 weeks of instruction, 6 data points. If you're monitoring weekly, that's probably going to be 6 weeks of instruction. And this is a key thing I think about when monitoring, looking at progress monitoring data. And I think I mentioned this in the opening session. We don't want to overly respond and correct to each individual data point. We look at this as a trend. And so if kids have a bad week or a bad data point, I don't want to change my whole instruction based on one data point. One data point is a data point, 2 data points starts a trend, 3 data points really starts to help me start to firm up that this is the direction they're heading in. So I want to be able to look at multiple data points together. So that's why we meet every 6 to 8 to 12 weeks to make these decisions around big changes to instruction, because we don't want to just make these huge changes. I don't want to say, oh, they had a bad data point, let's move them to a different curriculum. That can really create chaos for kids. These programs take time to start working. We want to let them work. We would probably make some minor tweaks if we're finding kids or before 6 to 8 weeks are having some challenges. We can definitely tweak the instruction, but we're not going to make major changes until we have a chance to meet as a team. But so 3 weeks of instruction, 6 data points, we will look at the most recent 4 data points, and we'll look at that against the goal line. And so if all 4 points are above the goal line, I would say kids are on track. That's a positive. We can either increase the goal if the goal is not ambitious enough. But again, if the goal is at the benchmark, I would say this kid's on track, continue doing what you're doing, and maybe consider exiting the student at some point. But this is what we want to see, the last 4 points above the goal line. If we see that the last 4 points are all below the goal line, we would want to consider adapting the intervention or changing and intensifying, because 4 points below the aim line indicate that this student is not on track, and we don't want to continue to do what we're doing. And then the more questionable one is if we see the 4 data points are, the last 4 are both above and below the aim line, I would continue with your intervention, because they're bouncing around that aim line and they're generally on track to meet their goal. Because remember, that aim line or that goal line from the baseline to the goal is what the growth that we would want to see for them to be on track. So if they're around it, they're up and below it, they're generally on track to meet their goal. So we'd want to continue doing what they're doing, collect a little bit more data, and then see if we need to make a change at some point. Okay. So that's the 4-point rule. So it's easy to do. We just look at the last 4 points and see, are they above, below, or above and below. Trendline analysis is a little bit different, and some progress monitoring measures calculate a trend line for you, some don't. Calculating a trend line on your own can be challenging and time consuming, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend calculating those on your own for all of your students. But if you have that built into your system, trend line can help you make good decisions. And so to use trend line analysis, we're going to look at 4 weeks of instruction and at least 8 data points. So for trend line, you need more data because it's got to be stable. So a minimum of 8 data points to be able to look at a stable trend line. And so we look at that and we compare it to the goal line. And if we see the trend line is headed up in a steeper direction than the goal line, then we might consider changing the goal if the goal is below the benchmark. But if the goal is at the benchmark, again, this is great. Like, you're on track, keep doing what you're doing, and at some point you may want to consider exiting the student from intervention. If the trend line is flatter or going down, perhaps, you want to consider adapting the intervention, because the trend line, again, is meant to measure and forecast out where students will be at the end of this intervention period. So progress monitoring data, to be honest, it's one of the closest things we have to a crystal ball in education. You can't tell the future, but progress monitoring data collected regularly is going to help you forecast out in general. If we keep doing what we're doing, this is generally where we're going to end up. And so this data indicates if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to end up behind the goal where we want to be. So you want to consider adapting. Right? And then this one, if the student's trend line and goal line are the same, so they're about on par with each other, similar, I would keep collecting data and continue to monitor progress. And you may see that trend line go up, trend line go down as you collect more data, and maybe you can make a better informed judgment. But again, the goal line is the growth that we want to see in order for kids to meet that end of year benchmark or end of year goal. So if they're on it, then great, continue doing what you're doing, collect more data until we see a student deviate from that, if we do. All right. So again, lots of information. Progress monitoring is kind of a heavy topic. There's a lot of technical pieces to it, but just share a couple resources here and then open it up for a few last questions if you have them. So I mentioned the NCII Academic Progress Monitoring Tools chart. If you don't already have a tool, it can help you kind of select one and look at the research behind some of those. It's also got NCII has a specific progress monitoring graphing tool. So if you don't have a database that graphs it for you, you can use their tool to graph progress monitoring data for your students on IEPs. And then there's a guide in there, strategies for setting high quality academic individualized education goals. It's going to go over a lot of what we talked about today, but it's a nice handy take home guide with that. I think that graphic that I shared with the different goal setting strategies might be a part of that. But it's on the website if it's not a part of that, but a nice resource for a lot of what we talked about today and kind of a one-stop shop. All right. There's also some training modules with NCII. They have one on graphing and analyzing progress monitoring data. How do you select the right tool? And then just an overview one on what is progress monitoring. So if you're looking at the decision-making piece of it, I would start with, or I would look at this one on graphing and analyzing progress monitoring. If you're more at the beginning stages around, I need to help my teachers understand what progress monitoring is and how do I select a tool, I would look at these two on the right. Those are going to be more fundamental and basic for you. And then there's some partner training models. IRIS has some really good modules on progress monitoring. If you haven't seen the IRIS modules, they are fantastic, very involved, tons of great resources. And then Progress Center has a really good one on the what and why of measurable annual goals. So a little bit more information on goal setting.